It's nice to be back in Farmingdale. And one of the reasons why I say it's nice to be back is because I was actually here 30 years ago. And I lasted 1 month. I was at SUNY Farmingdale. And my path to actually getting to SUNY Farmingdale was not as successful as we might think, which is why it only lasted a month in the first place. I was retained when I was in 4th grade. And my dad died when I was in 5th grade. My mom went back to get her GED when I was in 6th grade. And then when I got to my sophomore year in high school, I lacked enough credits to be a full-fledged sophomore, so I actually became a sub-sophomore. So they put me in a freshman homeroom. I was 2 years older than all of my peers. My struggles continued, and by the time I got to graduate from high school, I was ranked 262 out of 266. I was 4th from last in my class. So when I got to Farmingdale a few months later, I wasn't really prepared. Now I ended up failing out of 2 community colleges. And I know some of you are probably thinking, Lord, when does this story end? On my 3rd community college, I only went because they had a cross-country running team. And my sister Trish, who was National Honor Society when she was in high school, she talked to me and said, I just want you to have a 2-year degree. I just want you to go and try to get 2 years, have more than you have now. So I did, and I went to Hudson Valley in Troy. I walked in, and my coach said, DeWitt, you're not going to be a professional runner, so you need you to go to the Learning Assistance Center. And I walked into the LAC with a 1.7 GPA. And that semester, I walked out with a 3.86. I now have 2 master's degrees and a doctorate, all of which I had a 4.0 in. For the longest time, because I graduated from college with a bachelor's when I was 25, I felt like I was older than everybody else, including when people would ask me my age, and they would say, oh, you must have graduated in 1988. And I said, no, in 1989. And you could just see them sitting there doing the math. And it was like I was retained in elementary school. In fact, I often say that I loved Mrs. Flynn so much as a 4th grade teacher, I had her twice. What I experienced, and what I've come to realize other students experience when they go to school, is what's called alienation. Now, you have to excuse my upstate New York accent for coming out. And when I say upstate, I don't mean Yonkers. I actually grew up an hour north of Albany. And research shows that there are actually 2 forms of alienation. One is identification, when students don't feel an emotional connection to their school or to their teacher. And number 2 is powerlessness, when students don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning. Over the years, what I've come to find out is that when we look at things like social emotional learning, it's really important to keep coming back to the fact that students need emotional connection to their school community. Now, as an author and consultant now, I work with schools in the UK, all over North America and Australia. And one of the things that I find is that a lot of schools say all means all. But what I found is that that's not necessarily really true. Sometimes all means those kids that already fit in. When I was doing my doctoral research 10 years ago, I actually started to look at a marginalized population. I looked at our LGBTQ students and how well were they safeguarded when they came into school. It was pretty early on that I found that what I thought wouldn't be a controversial topic was going to be a very controversial topic. In fact, in New York State, I sent out surveys or requests for surveys to leaders from all over New York State. I had one school superintendent just north of me reply to my email, and she wrote, no. And I thought to myself, I wanted to reply and say, so I feel like you're on the fence about this. What can I say? What I found, though, is that over the time that I was doing my research, marginalized population like our LGBTQ students were not easily accepted. So over the years since doing that research, and I started looking at enabling conditions, I've furthered the whole idea of how can we actually engage students, because to me, If we really want to change the world, then we need to look within our schools right now and see how many students feel that emotional connection. Do we use sort of these things that they understand? Do we understand their use of social media? Do we understand the cultural nuances? So for the rest of our time together, what I would like to do is talk about 7 enabling conditions that I think our schools can actually put into place, whether you're a teacher, a leader, or a student, or a family member. It's meant to actually help us understand how to incorporate all of these marginalized populations. Number 1 starts with a common language and a common understanding. We often have a common language in school. Sometimes there are acronyms that people don't understand, but we do. The problem is we don't have a common understanding. Think of some of the biggest topics we talk about in school, things like the growth mindset. Carol Dweck has researched the growth mindset for many years. But recently, about 2 years ago, Dweck had to clarify her research. And why? Because we use the words growth mindset, but we weren't using them correctly. So she had to clarify her work in Education Week. Carol Ann Tomlinson, one of the creators of differentiated instruction, a few years ago had to clarify her work around differentiated instruction. And why? Because we say we're doing it, we use the words, but we don't put it into practice correctly. I'll give you another one, student engagement. As a school principal, it's very common for me to talk about the fact that I was looking for student engagement. But what if my idea of student engagement was compliant engagement, where the kids are sitting down in their seat, not moving around, the teacher's doing all the talking? But when I'm going in to look at a teacher's classroom, what if their idea of student engagement is authentic engagement, where the kids are up and moving around? When I walk into that classroom and I see the kids all moving around, I might say, ooh, we have to talk about your classroom management. Or even worse, I'll come back when you're teaching. And that teacher is very frustrated because they're thinking, I'm doing the greatest teaching because the kids are actually doing most of the dialogue. When we think about our language that we use in schools, we often have a common language, but we don't have a common understanding. The second enabling condition is teacher-student relationships. Now, John Hattie is a researcher at the University of Melbourne, and I work with him. John has done the largest meta-analysis of what works in education. It involves over 1,400 meta-analysis. He synthesizes those. He's looked at over 95,000 studies, and he has what's called influences on learning. Some of those influences are things like feedback, reciprocal teaching, the jigsaw method, classroom discussion. But one of them is teacher-student relationships. And what his research has shown is that it has a high impact on the outcomes of students. It builds that emotional connection. Now, as a teacher for 11 years, I prided myself on getting to know the kids' names within the first 15 to 20 minutes. I swear to you, it's a test I used to have my first graders give me, and there's nothing better than testing first graders, that you know their names. But as a school principal, I used to study the yearbook to get to know their names. Now, it was really great because I would go around, and because I was an elementary school principal, I could go into the lunchroom, and I could walk behind Doug, and I could say, hey, Doug, how are you doing today? And Doug would turn around and say, how do you know my name? I'm like, I am just that good. But what Doug didn't realize is that his mom actually writes his name on his lunchbox. And I can read, too. Russ Qualia has done research. Over 400,000 students he surveyed. Only 52% of the students who responded said, my teacher makes an effort to get to know me. Teacher-student relationships are really important, and there's nothing better than just standing at the doorway to actually welcome them in. Number 3 is images in hallways. Now, this might sound like a strange one, but look at that picture. It's from Orchard Elementary School. It was taken by an education leader named Tim Lauer outside of Portland, Oregon. Imagine what it's like to walk in and see that image. Because you see, the reality is when you go into schools and you look for murals, they're not always representative of all of the students within our school community. I was listening to a podcast with Willie Geist and Aquafina, who I think is hilarious. And she said, diversity is not a trend, it's a reality. Images matter because we know that there's curriculum and hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum is the fact that we're being taught something because we know we're missing from the dialogue. When we walk in and see images, we know when we're missing. I fly almost every week. When I'm walking down the gate, when I'm flying Delta, I'm walking down the gate, they have pictures on both sides of the gate before you get on the plane. One picture is of a gay couple. When I look at that, it makes me instantly feel like it's an inclusive situation. Images are so important, but people don't always see that. And if you don't think that images are important, then none of you would be on Instagram or Facebook. Another enabling condition is when we actually look at inclusive curriculum, books, and novels. Now, when I was doing my research around LGBT students, one of the things that I found is that in New York State at the time, the only curriculum that had LGBT students mentioned was in the health class, and it was around HIV and AIDS. Now, that's an important topic, but if that's the only thing you see, it sends a negative representation. When I was growing up in my social studies classes, our indigenous populations were represented in the books and the textbooks that we were learning from, but the reality is they were not positive representations. Even in my own experience as a guy that lost my dad when I was young, my mom never remarried. And one of the things that happened to me is that my teachers actually never read a book that had a one-parent household. So for the longest time, I felt like I was missing from that dialogue as well. Now, another enabling condition that we need to look at for our students is that of mindfulness. Now, mindfulness sounds like a soft thing. We know that there have been apps that have really blown out of proportion over the past few years. And we've seen a lot of books or even magazines that talk about mindfulness. When I was a school principal, we started incorporating mindfulness back in 2006, 2007. And why? Because we saw that students were coming unprepared to be able to deal with these emotions that they had going on. What I have found over the years is that mindfulness is seen as something that's soft. We need to teach kids to be stronger. I don't think there's anything stronger than being able to understand why you're reacting the way that you're reacting. In fact, I think that mindfulness is something that will help us react in a much stronger way. It's too easy in these days of social media to send out negative thoughts and hurry up and have a quick reaction because we didn't take time to think about how we were feeling. I think we all, whether it's the adults or students, need to understand how we react, because that actually builds resilience and helps us better prepare for our future. Now, the second to last enabling condition that I think about is professional learning and professional development. This was actually researched by Andy Hargraves and Michael Folan. They're international systems experts. Professional learning is when we work with teachers and we talk about if we're going to incorporate this teaching strategy or this instructional strategy or this student engagement strategy, what are the outcomes we should be looking for? Professional development is a little bit different. It's about how we develop mindfulness around topics. You see, in schools, we talk a lot about things like mental health, social emotional learning, and trauma. But not everybody is equipped to be able to teach about those topics. There's a phenomena that started in research back in the 1970s by a guy named Albert Bandura at Stanford University. He looked at self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the confidence we have in our own abilities. And what we found, Shannon Moran and Garice out of the College of William & Mary, what they found is that self-efficacy is context specific. In certain situations, I feel very confident. In other situations, I feel less confident. So you might have a teacher that's really good at teacher-student relationships, but not as great at instructional strategies. So professional learning development helps give us the opportunity to talk about these issues. The last sort of goes along with professional learning development, and it's the last enabling condition. And it's that of school board policies and codes of conduct. What I have found is that in many states, we need to be able to make sure that we're incorporating strategies to actually work with marginalized populations. And we need to be able to incorporate those in our school board policies and codes of conduct. But those board policies and codes of conduct are not worth the paper they're written on if we don't do something about it. Now, enabling conditions are just a start. It's a starting point to have these conversations and to feel like we can trust to have these conversations. What I hope is that if we're really going to change the world, we need to look at why our students are alienated. And then we need to build that social emotional connection to their school. Thank you for your time.